I do want to say we're really delighted. My wife and I are in LA at the moment, and Carol's here, to be here at USC, which I think is an absolutely fantastic university. And one of the reasons I'm so keen to talk today about the global economic and security challenges of our time is I think that USC is particularly well placed to make contributions to international discussions about these things. Compared to us in the UK, for example, you really do reach across the Pacific, and you have a very large number of students from across the world, as we can see here this evening, this morning in some respects. And I think it's interventions from USC and other institutions like this which are particularly important. I was delighted to thank the Dean of the school, Jack Knott, for his invitation to be here. And in considering how best to begin and to address this subject, I've been greatly assisted by the clarity offered last week by President Donald Trump when he took up the rather surprising, to me at any rate, role of Chairman of the United Nations Security Council during the General Assembly in New York. He said there, and I think his words are significant, that the ideology of globalism had run its course and the US under his leadership was pursuing a doctrine of patriotism. And that's the tension which I intend to address throughout this conversation this morning. I was tempted to rely on Samuel Johnson, the British writer's famous remark in April 1775 that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. In his case, the scoundrel being the former British Prime Minister William Pitt. But I think that Donald Trump, President Trump's formulation, nicely crystallises the challenges facing politics right across the world right now of globalism or patriotism. I will argue that these are false opposites. They're presented as opposites, but that they are false opposites, and hope today to suggest ways in which we should be addressing the relationship between them. I want to begin with some obvious points of history. Following the disastrous economic slump of the 1930s, the growth of the European totalitarian states, particularly Germany, Russia, but also others, and the then catastrophic in terms of lives lost, though ultimately victorious Second World War, which led to dominant American power across the world, there was an almost universal consensus at that time that steps had to be taken from 1945 onwards to prevent that process happening again, because it had been so disastrous over that period, notably in the economic, social and international security fields. And that's how the leaders of that time acted. On the economic front, this meant adopting the macroeconomic approach identified with the Cambridge economist John Maynard Keynes, reinforced by the Marshall Plan in Europe and Keynesian counter-cyclical economic management by governments across the whole world. On social policy, it led to the foundation of a wide variety of health and welfare systems which took different forms in different countries, but all of which sought to avoid the disastrous failures of 1919, the post-First World War situation, which had led to widespread destitution and despair, which themselves were an immediate cause of the troubled 1930s and 1940s to which I mentioned earlier. And in the international security field, the need for effective international institutions was agreed in place of the failed League of Nations. And so the United Nations was founded here in California at San Francisco on October the 24th, 1945. So in each of these three key dimensions, economic, social policy, international security, the leaders of that time decided to take hold of the situation and not to allow the disasters which had preceded and created that war to dominate our lives since. Those decisions, in my opinion, underpinned the most successful evolution of prosperity and social justice in the history of the world. These have all developed in different ways in the 60 to 70 years that followed, and there were lots of significant modernizations and modifications along the way. It wasn't that they were taken in aspic from 1945. They were adopted, changed, modified as circumstances changed, but under the same fundamental principles. And the overall model sustained itself and, broadly speaking, retained the confidence of the world. It was seen as a successful model for our success in our societies. And the model did even better when we consider the political development of the global economy over those years. The post-1945 democratic economic and social model has been the ambition which has driven enormous change over that time. Just to list some of the most significant. Fascist or militaristic Greece, Spain and Portugal were succeeded by democracy. Apartheid South Africa has been succeeded by democracy. Colonialist Southern Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, also succeeded by democracy. Latin and American dictatorships of the most terrible type, again replaced by democracy. The whole of totalitarian Eastern and Central Europe, the Soviet Empire, has been succeeded by democracy. And in Southeast Asia too, forms of democracy have replaced dictatorship. And Russia and China have comprehensively changed their systems of government. I perfectly well understand that we've seen no such progress in the Middle East. That's the most significant geographical area of the world where we have not succeeded in getting any established process of change, and it's no coincidence that that's the source of many of the difficulties and tensions in the world today. And I also know, of course, that in many parts of the world substantial problems do indeed remain. I'm not suggesting we've got to some nirvana, some utopia over this period. And it's also the case that some of these changes that I've described have had challenges which we can see today in various respects, kickbacks against certain of the changes that were achieved. But I do believe that it remains the case that these were absolutely enormous changes in just one generation. I was campaigning against all these things when I was a student at university, and I don't take personal credit for all the transformations around the world which have happened, but the fact is just over one generation, my lifetime, these enormous changes have taken place, quite extraordinary. They're changes in the right direction, which prove importantly that change for the good can happen and did happen, and it can give an optimistic account of how the future can happen, and it can happen without enormous violence or bloodshed. But side by side with these enormous successes, we have also seen the steady expansion of world trade and destruction of tariffs and protections, so-called globalization, the phrase which is widely used, which has led large parts of our populations to lose faith in the capacity of this post-war system to meet the problems they experience, whether economic, social or international in nature. Whatever the economic successes of globalization in the round, overall, looking at the thing in total, there have been significant widespread concerns of both individuals and whole communities about economic desolation in some geographic area or another, such as the Rust Belt here in the United States of America, the former coal and steel communities in the UK and France and elsewhere, nor did it address worries that have risen about control of the immigration, which was an important side effect of the globalization process which I've just described. In short, those who believed that they'd lost out from that very process of globalization turned towards those political leaders who spoke out against the status quo, this established system of achievement over the last 60 or 70 years, rather than just going along with it. Thus, tens of millions of people moved their support, and are continuing to do so, away from the economic and social model which had served so well for decades, and they voted accordingly. They turned away from the post-war settlement towards the challenges represented by BREXIT in the United States of America, the idea that we should just pull out of the European Union, Donald Trump here in the US, and similar movements in a large number of other countries across the world. There's a new climate that we have to deal with and address. To me, this experience of marginalisation as a result of the globalisation process is the core reason for the Brexit vote in the UK in the June 2016 vote. The EU itself, the European Union itself, was not, in my opinion, the central reason for that vote, though, as I explained in a moment, it was certainly part of it. The deeper experience of the economic consequence of globalisation was at the core. And for those of you who wonder why the referendum was ever held, why did we get into a position of having this vote in the UK, the same explanation is central. The traditional Conservatives were losing support to their challengers in a party called the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, who articulated the concerns I'm describing, in particular about immigration. And the Conservative leader, David Cameron, was trying to minimise Conservative losses to them, which had been substantial in a number of elections. The challenge posed by those opposed to globalisation, to the post-war system, is existential. Were they to succeed, the Trump Brexit type of argument, the whole post-war system that, in my opinion, has brought such good and protected against so many different risks would be at threat. But a central part of my argument today is that the main responsibility for this state of affairs lies less with Trump and the Brexit supporters than with those of us who didn't use our power when we held it, our economic and political power, well enough to address the concerns that those people had. And so they then fell for the snake oil offers put forward by the new nativist populists, as they have been called. After all, Brexit and Trump only exploited a failure by the governing establishment. It was that governing establishment which had failed to reinvigorate the very institutions which had been established after the Second World War, and it was those institutions and systems and that establishment which had responsibility for dealing with these issues and hadn't succeeded in doing so. And that's why I maintain that the challenge which the centre of politics now has to meet is not just to oppose what Brexit and Trump mean. I think that's a barren oppositionalist approach in its own account, but to come forward with ideas, proposals, thoughts to recreate for the future a national and international system of governance which can properly meet for all the concerns which were reflected in those votes. It's not a knockdown battle between Brexit and the rest. It's a question of whether we can offer a way of running our society, running the economy, running the world in a way that works more effectively. Now, it's difficult to do that because, of course, there's been enormous change in so many parts of our lives since 1945. I said earlier that the post-1945 doctrines had all developed in different ways over the following years, and that there were lots of modifications along the way. But the fundamental question for me is whether we changed enough so that our government systems could follow through the principles established in 1945 on the economy, on social policy, on international security, in order to cope with the vast and fundamental changes which have taken place. And we need to start by understanding what those changes have been. The pace of change has been enormous, and it's accelerating. And it's worth considering the nature of the economic and social and security changes that they've been. Our economy's changed, first and foremost, so that capital could move at lightning speed round the world, a process followed by rapid movement of people migrating across the world. These changes seriously weakened our ability to monitor and, if necessary, regulate the workings of the world's financial markets in order to ensure that the system operates in the world's overall economic interest and not simply the individuals and organisations which were doing that. A stable state of affairs has still not been truly established in the long-term and rigorous way, despite the immense and damaging shock of the 2008 financial crisis, which illustrated starkly that we didn't have regimes in place in order to be able to protect us against those kinds of threats. Some commentators are of the view that the tensions in the existing economic system are such that a further 2008 can certainly not be excluded, which would of course be devastating. Serious people involved in the 2008 events are saying, watch out, it could easily come around again. And I would say we still haven't got an international financial control system which can deal with that in the way that is necessary. At the same time, over those years, world economic activity has moved eastwards and southwards, as those economies, notably China and Japan, have become increasingly powerful and significant. It's thus no surprise that the economic G5, where it started, the 5 big economic powers, became the G6, the G7, the G8 and then the G20, as efforts were made to bring economic governance by collaborating across these major economic economies throughout the world. But we're still a long way from finding an effective economic governance regime for the world, which is why we remain vulnerable. The whole economics of the world, of course, has been transformed over that period even more deeply by accelerating technological change. As you know, the first industrial revolution, which used water and steam power to mechanise production, was followed by the second, using electric power to create mass production, and then after 1945, followed by the third industrial revolution, using electronics and information technology to automate production. And that's transformed the production of both goods and services across the world. It's the major driving force, really, in the whole globalisation process I've described. But we're now moving to a fourth industrial revolution, which has been widely discussed, characterised by a fusion of technologies. That is, blurring the lines between the physical, digital and biological spheres. And the speed of current breakthroughs has no historical precedent. When compared with previous industrial revolutions, this fourth industrial revolution is evolving at an exponential rate rather than a linear pace. Moreover, it's disrupting almost every industry in almost every country. The possibilities of billions of people connected by mobile devices with unprecedented processing power, storage capacity and access to knowledge are unlimited. And these possibilities will be multiplied by emerging technology breakthroughs in fields such as artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, nanotechnology, biotechnology, materials science, energy storage, quantum computing. Enormous changes coming. Those people who say, let's all stop this changing process, we can just go on, can put that idea in the bin. It's an accelerating and a rapidly accelerating process of change with which we have to deal. Among the many implications of this accelerating process of economic and technological change is the transformation of entire systems of production, management, and very importantly, governance. In addition, it highlights the critical importance of higher quality education and training and spotlights the further decline of traditional communities which get left behind as this whole process proceeds. Now, of course, these economic changes, which are deep and fundamental, have been mirrored by enormous social changes over this period as well, the whole structure of societies, including the enfranchisement of women, though still a long way to go, the acceptance of more liberal approaches to style of lives, redefinitions of conventional family structures, including responsibility for caring throughout life, and an often increased state role. And the good news of an ageing society brings enormous implications for security and independence. Cities have become even more significant as large numbers of people migrate from rural to urban areas across the whole world, and enormous world cities are being created. More generally, migration has transformed the ethnic and demographic makeup of opportunities so that Islam and other faiths have a far more significant role to play than was the case before 1945. As with the economic changes, the changes in traditional societies are deep, profound and accelerating rapidly across the world, while of course the communications revolution means that the whole world is looking at this in real time. This process of economic and social change threatens the security and self-confidence of communities. That is what, in political terms, has the potential to mobilise hundreds of millions of people behind the dishonest fantasy that the world can be stopped and they can get off, because it's what people desperately want, but it won't happen. And as with the economy and society, the whole international security landscape has been transformed over this period and new challenges created. First and foremost, we've moved from the bipolar US-Soviet Cold War period of 1945 to 1989, nearly 50 years, where you had essentially two powers running the world, for better or for worse, a bipolar system. After 1989, we had a unipolar world when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall came down. I think that lasted till about 2006, and during that period, from 1989 to 2006, the US was essentially the single world power. And that was the state of affairs. But in my opinion, the midterm congressional elections in the second George W. Bush term in 2006, which responded to the tribulations of Afghanistan and Iraq and the sense that the US couldn't run the world everywhere it went, as people thought, led to a state of affairs which has been continued by both Obama and Trump, that the US is no longer claiming that it can run everything that happens in the world. And so there's now a zero polar world, from the two polar world to the one polar world to the zero polar world. And of course, the zero polar world should more accurately be seen as a multipolar world whose many risks and difficulties are steadily becoming more difficult to resolve because there isn't a clear power structure within which that can be addressed. Those uncertainties pose a whole series of new challenges, including the rise of other powers such as China and Iran, the spread of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, which of course underpin current tensions around Iran and North Korea. And a direct consequence of this uncertainty is the growth of terrorism as a threat and creating enormous damage in many parts of the world, also including important consequences such as migration away from disaster areas, which puts pressures elsewhere around. And new international security challenges have emerged, such as the impact of climate change, which has knock-ons in a whole series of different ways, which are now only still fully being understood. The inability to create stability in the Western Balkans and lots of issues that can arise in the European situation. The Arab Spring and its responses to the Arab Spring. The creation of the so-called frozen conflicts across the former Soviet Empire. And new nationalisms have begun to emerge in places like Catalonia and Scotland, rather surprisingly, one might think over the time. But nationalism is again the same thing coming through. I don't suggest they're violent threats, those, but they are nevertheless building tensions in a different kind of way. And of course, sadly, tragically, the conflicts in Palestine and the Middle East remain as deeply serious as they ever were for the whole of the last 70 years, with us seemingly not being able to make any progress towards resolving them. So faced with this new assertiveness, this lack of overall power control, we have not been able to create international institutions which are fully able to handle these challenges. And that's the challenge that we have to face, the weakness of international institutions. So in all of these areas where change has been immensely rapid, what should have been done and what should now be done? We don't have some kind of world government which fantasists talk about. We can have an overall control of the world. It doesn't exist. I don't myself think it would be desirable, but whether it's desirable or not, we haven't got it, which could try and create an orderly and secure world context. Instead, we have in place a whole cat's cradle of international institutions with the UN at their centre, which were established to deal with a whole range of these international challenges. I'll just list some of them because there are so many working in a complex and interrelated way. In the economic field, for example, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the International Labour Organization, as well as the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the UN Industrial Development Organization. A range of organisations to regulate communications, such as the International Civil Aviation Organisation, the International Maritime Organisation, and so on. These organisations have had some successes. There have been areas where there have been achievements that have taken place, but also important failures. I've mentioned already the 2008 crash. This network of economic institutions wasn't able to stop that happening. And an important regional economic experiment, the Eurozone in Europe, has so far had a rocky path. I would say with more success than failure, but nevertheless it's not an unadorned success to look at how that situation has developed. In social policy, the 1948-51 Convention on Human Rights, the Refugee Convention, the Law of the Sea remain important, though outdated in certain important respects and needing modernisation. International Organisation of Migration plays an increasingly important role, as does the Schengen zone in the European Union. The United Nations Refugee Agency makes valiant efforts to cope with the appallingly difficult challenges of refugee movement throughout the world. Education and culture addressed by the UNESCO and World Tourism Organization, whilst the World Health Organization plays an important and relatively successful role in the field of health. And the more recently articulated concerns about the environment and climate change have led to the UN Conference on Environment and Development and the Framework Convention through big discussions in Kyoto, Copenhagen, Cancun and Paris, though of course big issues now about the United States withdrawing from some of that process. Now again, the story I'm trying to convey is it's not that they're not a series of efforts to address these questions in these areas. There are a significant number of organisations, but how successful are they? Are they doing the job of dealing with these issues? And that's particularly true when I come to the final group of them in the field of security, where the central organisation, of course, is the United Nations Security Council, with important peacekeeping responsibilities, for example, in the Lebanon and elsewhere. Some of those are shared with the EU and NATO, for example, in former Yugoslavia. Its judgments, the Security Council's judgments about the legality of military action, are of immense importance, but controversial and sometimes cumbersome. Important, very important, weapons control agreements, such as the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty or the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, are under constant pressure. The International Atomic Energy Agency remains centrally important, but with difficulties carrying out its remit in lots of important countries and important parts of the world. The Middle East and tensions around Russia's relationship with its neighbours remain difficult to influence in a positive direction. And there's a string of almost comic post-colonial hangovers, such as Gibraltar, Diego Garcia, Antarctic and the Falkland Islands, all of which have the potential to cause immense conflict unless there's a significant regulatory regime in place. Of course, during the Cold War, until 1991, the ability of the Security Council to act was frozen by the requirement of consensus, and that's broadly continued to be the case afterwards. There was a veto by each of the 5 permanent Security Council members. And so its contribution has been marked more by impotence than by the ability of internationally authorised intervention, military or otherwise, to resolve difficult or potentially difficult conflict situations. There have been important parallel institutions, notably NATO and the European Union. NATO has been able to contribute to security in certain situations, such as the former Yugoslavia, but has some difficulty defining its role. The EU was exceptionally important in securing an end to the Franco-German conflict, which had marked European history for nearly a century through appalling conflict. It then helped to extend democracy, first in southern Europe in the 1970s and 80s, and then in Central and Eastern Europe after 1990. But for the last 20 years, it's been unable to make decisive interventions, even in issues of critical significance, such as controlling migration into Europe and securing the external Schengen border of the continent. The efforts to develop a common foreign policy across the EU have been stuttering, so that the EU has been unable to exercise very significant and visible influence, for example, on its southern border in North Africa. Other institutions, like the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, have made a contribution at the margin, but not centrally. There have been conflicts and confusions between the different organisations, which have led, for example, in the Western Balkans, to overlaps of responsibility, silo thinking and confusion. The different organisations have had different mandates, different approaches, different contributions to make. So in the complex potpourri of organisations and initiatives that I've described, and which has been the international system as it has developed since 1945, there have since the mid-1990s been few apparent and obvious successes in dealing with the security challenges of change of our time. When people consider these challenges, look at them, whether it's terrorism or Russia and the Ukraine or whatever, they're not seeing these international institutions as really helping successfully solve these problems. I would argue myself that there has been some success, but the overall message to our populations has been more of irrelevance, impotence and marginalisation in the face of the very real challenges which exist. In all of these areas, economic, social, international security, the answer is of course not to pull out or to weaken these international institutional arrangements. It's to strengthen them and make the system work better, and that's the challenge which I think we have to take up. That's also the case about the European Union, which has big achievements to its name, but which has become stalled. The response is not to withdraw, but it's to make the EU work better in fields such as immigration, management of the Eurozone and climate change, as well as defending the democracy and human rights that it played such a big role in establishing. So finally, the choice we face with this state of affairs that I've described, and back to Donald Trump. He stated at the UN that the choice is patriotism or globalism. I'd say more accurately, a strategy of America first, or let's work together and solve the problems we all have together. I don't believe that go it alone is an option for the United States, for the UK, or for anyone else. It is true that in many ways conventional politics has failed to solve the problems and to address the challenges which preoccupies those who have been most hit by the globalisation revolution. And it's true that the cat's cradle of international organisations, which I've described earlier, has not done enough to address the challenges of change and has lost the confidence of tens of millions of people. And it's true that these important failures have encouraged a sense of impotence in millions of people about their own ability to control their destinies in the world in which they live, which is, by the way, why the key slogan in the 2016 Brexit vote in the UK was "Take back control," and that's what mobilised people to vote for Brexit. And it's true that this state of affairs has promoted a sense of nationalism and hostility to international collaboration, which is very damaging indeed. It has encouraged a stop the world I want to get off sort of mentality, which really does believe that we shouldn't get involved with faraway countries of which we know little. And it's true that a whole set of political movements from the extremes have been able to thrive in this climate. Whether the Tea Party movement here, Donald Trump here, Marine Le Pen, Alternative for Deutschland, Swedish Democrats in continental Europe, Brexit, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, and I would add Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, Bernie Sanders here, all from the extremes, being the oppositionists who are expressing the anger that people feel about the failure of the world to deal with these consequences of globalisation. I do understand the feelings which lead people to support the oppositionist views which these people represent. Such oppositionism is indeed the depressing spirit of the times. But the truth is that this form of isolationism and protectionism offers absolutely nothing. It recalls the socialism in one country which defined Stalin's battle against Trotsky and led to decline for 3 generations in Russia as they isolated themselves from the rest of the world's society. It was proposed in British politics by Tony Blair's alternative economic strategy in the UK, and the early François Mitterrand presidency of France tried to go down that route. But these were all dropped or reversed by the acid test of reality. Isolation, inward-looking governance, economics will not work and will not succeed. And that's the same way that, in my opinion, the US-America first isolation of Donald Trump, or even that of George W. Bush before 9/11, when his whole approach was transformed by the reality of this appalling attack. These offer no answers at all. Look at the comparison today between the economic welfare of those in the EU member Poland and those across the border in Ukraine. Massive differences because of Poland getting involved in the wider economic community. Understand that innovation and efficiency happening across the world in all economies will affect everyone, and that rapid change is the route to economic development. Go it alone is a short-term populist slogan which offers no solutions and means that the problems which our world faces will never be properly addressed. There's no possibility of insulation from the rest of the world. We have to engage, not to walk away. So the challenge, and this will be the final part of my remarks today, is how to work to make our international system work better and more effectively. How not to retire into our shells, but to demonstrate that by working together, building a better international system, we can solve the problems we have to deal with. And I want to say that I think the Solprice School can play a role in this, and I'm going to describe how in just a second. But the idea that we should just walk away and look at our boots will offer absolutely nothing. The problem we face is that the internationalist approach is also the difficult approach. Getting people to work together to create international institutions that really work is not easy. It's not straightforward. The go-it-alone approach is popular and easy to argue, and we've seen those popular, easy arguments, and millions of people respond to those arguments. So we have to construct an approach to working together to create the international framework which respects the spirit of 1945 with means of the present to deal with them. So what are the things that have to be done? What are the approaches? First and foremost, I think we have to build a sense of national purpose in each of our countries, which defines ourselves as playing a role in the international context, accepting that we bear responsibility for shaping the international future of the world. Some of us more than others, great powerful economies like the United States, UK, play particular roles, and we have to say, in our country, we have a mission of what we want to do. I can certainly say in the UK, there have been serious knockbacks to our confidence to do that. The Iraq War, whatever its merits and demerits, and I supported it strongly and still think it was the right thing to do, has destroyed significant aspects of confidence in parts of the UK about that. When we had a vote about the position on Syria in the British Parliament a couple of years ago, which David Cameron was proposing to engage in action to try and deal with chemical weapons in Syria, he was defeated in Parliament and pulled back immediately, and wide comments that then influenced Obama to pull back as well. There's a lack of self-confidence in our views, our values, in countries like the US and the UK, which is symbolised by the Brexit vote, symbolised by the election of Donald Trump. But the first place for us to start is to say, as a great country with a great history, with a great contribution to make to the world, actually we need to go out and make that contribution to the world and find the best way to do that. And that's of itself a very important thing to say. Ridiculous to say it in California, which must be one of the most exciting, positive, optimistic parts of the world you could possibly imagine, with immense achievements to its name in all kinds of dimensions of life. But that building a sense of national purpose, where in our nations we see ourselves as part of a world, is a key part of that process, and that requires describing our history, our values, our circumstances, not in opposition to disasters, not in opposition to what other people say, but because out of our spirits and our approach that has to be done. Secondly, we have to define what engaging in that international world really means. This is much more difficult. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister I served, made a lecture in Chicago early in his first term of office about the conditions under which one would seek to intervene militarily across the world. And we had interventions which were very important. Small interventions in Sierra Leone, bigger interventions in former Yugoslavia. There was a piece in the paper today just saying there are large numbers of children coming to adulthood now, whose name is Tony Blair in Albanian, because they were named after the intervention. Quite true, apparently, and it's certainly the case. And you've seen it here. If you go to Kurdistan today, people will say we were heroes for helping engage in that process. But we did intervene. We did make a positive difference. There were examples of non-intervention. For example, in Rwanda, where a couple of million people were killed because nobody intervened when we could have done to stop that process happening. But because of what has happened and the self-confidence being weakened, as I described, we need a state of affairs where there's a clear explanation and understanding of what engagement would actually mean. Firstly, militarily, when is it legitimate for us to intervene militarily? What's the purpose of that military intervention? How would we conduct ourselves? I would say a major lesson of Iraq, for example, is we didn't operate after the war anything like well enough to strengthen the societies and country in those circumstances. A whole set of discussions to be had about that. And it's not just military. You've got to make it clear that military intervention isn't the only way to intervene. A colleague of mine made a speech in an event I was at in Tunisia a couple of years ago, and she said what we needed was not boots on the ground, which is the phrase that's always used, but soft shoes on the ground. We need to have a process of supporting, whether in the traditional soft power means, a set of different ways of building strong institutions which don't rely simply on military intervention. Education, institutional building, economic trade and aid. There are all kinds of examples one could give of this, and that all the discussion about engagement shouldn't simply be about military engagement, important though that may be at certain circumstances. But we need much more thinking around this. There simply is not enough thinking about it. Confidence has been weakened. We need to understand what forms of intervention are right and are wrong. Those people who say we should never intervene militarily or never engage in other countries militarily, I think are wrong. And I think there are plenty of examples where intervention has made a difference where otherwise millions of people would be killed and could make a difference in creating a proper future. The challenge is getting the intervention right, either militarily or in other areas, and that's a very tough call. The third is to understand what sanctions, economic or otherwise, can and cannot do. A traditional technique in terms of trying to enforce the will of the world has been to place economic sanctions on countries which are in violation. The classic case was Iraq, of course, under Saddam Hussein, where there was a string of, I think, 12 Security Council resolutions asking him to open himself to inspection on weapons of mass destruction, which he refused to work with. And it was eventually his refusal to accept those sanctions over a period of time that led to the invasion of Iraq. But what kind of sanctions succeed? When we put sanctions, as now, on Putin's Russia, are the sanctions that we're putting in successful or working or not? Are we targeting the right people? What's the way of doing it? And it's an easy political response, I speak as a former politician, to say, okay, we don't want to invade, but we'll put in sanctions. Well, actually, that doesn't tell you anything. It's a question of what sanctions you're talking about, how you apply them, where you target them, how you use them, in what way. And of course, there's not much point in applying sanctions if only a small number of countries apply the sanctions, if other people aren't operating in those ways. So that's where we need thought. And then we need, fourthly, to work at better forms of international engagement. We have to really think in that range of organisations that I described, the economic ones, the social ones, and so on. What is the international framework that should operate now? Is the UN Convention on Human Rights or the UN Convention on Refugees, done in 1945 to 48, well suited to the modern world in the way that it operates? I sat in a British cabinet where there was a serious discussion of Britain withdrawing from the Convention on Human Rights. Extraordinary. I was totally against it and it didn't happen. But the reason why that's proposed, and why, by the way, it was proposed by the then leader of the opposition, Michael Howard, was because of the constraints it puts on your behaviour in terms of dealing with quite serious issues that arise. So, and there are also other financial issues, things like the Tobin tax in the financial areas and so on. So in these four areas, I want to say to the Sol Price School and to the colleagues you have around the world, I think the political classes, the governing classes, would really benefit from good, solid work by internationalist institutions working with others about how to address these challenges. How do you build that sense of national purpose which reflects the fundamental values of the nation? How do you define what forms of engagement could be done, what forms of engagement couldn't be done, what's the way of dealing with it? How do you then get that onto the public agenda? How do you get better understanding of what sanctions can and cannot do? What's worth doing in sanctions, what isn't worth the time of day? And how do we work at international engagement in all of these institutions to say, what do we do? So to take the example of Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, what steps would we take to extend it to India, Pakistan, the other places where conflicts could lead to the most appalling conflicts? How do we find better policing systems for weapons of mass destruction, chemical warfare, and so on? So what I'm really saying here, Mike, is I think there's a whole range of serious, thoughtful work in which the academic world, working with the practical world, has a real benefit that it can offer to trying to bring into politics, into discussion, how we make an internationalist approach succeed. Because if we don't succeed in actually positing a serious internationalist approach which can succeed, then the go-it-aloners win the argument. Because we will not be able to mobilise an argument saying better to work internationally when you look at the international organisations and they're not really succeeding. Just to give one example in my own case, I wrote this pamphlet 6-7 years ago now, The EU and Migration, A Call for Action, which I published and tried unsuccessfully to get the EU to really take good action on dealing with the migration challenges that it faced. I believe, it's rather self-serving to say it, but I'm a politician, so self-serving is what I do. I believe that had it been agreed, we would not have had the appalling tens of thousands of deaths in the Mediterranean, the circumstances and all the knock-ons. But for a whole string of reasons, it wasn't agreed and didn't happen. But we need all kinds of things like this, saying, well, how can the EU act rather than not act when it's got a problem it has to face and do it effectively? How can the EU improve the operation of the Eurozone so that it doesn't leave some parts of Europe in some area of desolation? How do we make the test ban agreement treaties actually work? And that's where I really think work could be done, should be done. And I mention it here in particular at USC, where, as I say, I feel very privileged to be, because you have such a tremendous range of people, not just in the Sol Price School, but across the whole campus, of people who really are expert and knowledgeable in these kind of areas. Then finally, internationalists need some wins. I said there hadn't been successes recently. We need, even at a small scale, some wins where international action is shown to succeed and solve a problem, make a difference. So we shouldn't target just the enormous problems, but we should target others as well. Though we have had an enormous problem which the internationalist approach targeted, which was climate change, and the Paris agreements and so on really took things further forward. I was talking to some students from China earlier this week about the massive changes which had happened in China in terms of dealing with climate change over the last 5 to 10 years. And it's a massive transformation of a whole society in the way it's being thought about. Internationalist agreements can make a change, can make a difference, and should do. So I would say the urgent lists are about things like chemical and nuclear weapons, about looking at North Africa and stabilizing the North African countries, about seeking to try and resolve some of these frozen conflicts which could easily explode in particular ways in the Caucasus or other areas. But take fairly small areas as well as the big ones, and if we could get a couple of successes in those areas where international agreement really did come together and say, okay, we've worked internationally, whether through the UN Security Council or by other means or whatever, and we've actually, by our international activity, made a step of progress in the right direction, then that's what we need to give us strength, because we haven't got enough arguments in the recent time for the success of international action. Of course, we've got enormous arguments in historic time. There were these enormous successes after 1945. But what's critically important, and the whole thing I've tried to emphasize more than anything this morning, is we have to get to a situation where we're solving the problems before the disasters rather than waiting for the disasters, like the economic slump in the 30s and the Second World War, and say, blimey, that was a bit bad, let's try and get it together in a way it doesn't happen. We need to get onto the front foot and do it beforehand. And those people who take that view have to work really hard to find the ways in which to achieve it. I conclude by saying I know it's not at all easy. I know it's very difficult to do this. But I also know that there's tremendous capacity, brain power across the world to be able to focus on doing it, and an immense human spirit across the world which wants to do it in this way. And we have to see off those people who say go it alone's the answer, whether they're in Britain, America or anywhere else, because the go it alones are short-term snake oil salesmen which will not provide solutions for the future. We have to find resolute, strong, enduring solutions for the future. I think that's all I'm going to say this morning, Mike, but as I say, more than happy to move to questions and discussion.